So last time we looked at negotiable instruments, these unique documents that are essential to modern day commercial finance. And we're going to go into a bit more detail now about how these negotiable instruments are created, the formation of negotiable instruments. Now we know that negotiable instruments serve these two different functions. They can be a substitute for cash, or they can be a way that a maker can obtain credit. We've also talked about this concept. A negotiable instrument must be easily transferable without danger of being uncollectible. And therefore, we require special rules to ensure that negotiable instruments may be readily transferred. If there are inhibitions to easy transferability, if there are restrictions on that, then that indicates that this would make a pretty poor substitute for cash. And we want to keep this as fluid and as liquid as possible. So these rules ensure that a negotiable instrument can be collected even if the maker of the instrument has a claim against the original payee. Even though there's a dispute between the original maker of the note and the payee on the note, if the payee transfers the note to a third-party purchaser, that third-party purchaser can collect the note from the maker, can collect the amount of the note from the maker, regardless of any claim that the maker had against the original payee on the note. So in this lecture, we're going to look at the formation of negotiable instruments, and after this lecture, you should be able to answer these following questions. What is negotiation? What do we mean by negotiation? What are the elements of a negotiable instrument? We started on this last time. We'll reinforce that material today. What factors do not affect negotiability? Things that may look to be negotiable, but in fact are not. Now, to be negotiable, the law requires a signed writing. We need a signed writing. When we talk about negotiation, what is negotiation? Negotiation is the transfer of rights to a negotiable instrument from one party to another. So it is a transfer of rights in an instrument from one party to another through a process called negotiation. If it is order paper must be endorsed and delivered in order to be negotiated. And we'll talk a lot more about what endorsement means and delivery as well. Let's start with a writing. The law requires a writing. What does that mean? The instrument must be in written form. And the instrument must be written on material that lends itself to permanence. Paper, fine. Clay tablet that may erode in the rain, probably not fine. We could write it, we could cut it into a table. Any of those, as long as there's a writing and it's on material that lends itself to permanence, then that indicates that it is likely to be meet the standard of a writing for a negotiable instrument. It must be portable, meaning we can't inscribe this on a statue that cannot be easily carried around. The instrument has to be portable, has to be able to be transported from one place to another. So we need a writing and we need a signature. The instrument has to be signed. So what does it mean to be signed? What do we mean when we say signed? Well, the signature just has to be any symbol. And in fact, the UCC gives extreme latitude in determining what is meant by sign. So the signature can be any symbol that is made manually or through use of a device or a machine. The signature can occur at any location on the document. You can use any name, including a trade name or an assumed name, a word, a mark, or a symbol. If you want to use an X, that can be a signature for the purposes of the UCC. A thumbprint, your initials, all of these can be signatures. A rubber stamp, an electronic signature. There's virtually no limitations on what is meant. Finally, it must be executed or adopted by the signer with a present intention to authenticate the writing, meaning the signature is meant to establish that it is you, the maker, who has made the promise contained within the instrument, or the order to pay that's found within the instrument. So when the signer executes the document, it is meant to indicate that they are authenticating the document. This is my official document, and I authenticate that by use of my signature. Now, who must sign? Well, the maker must sign if it is a note, a promissory note, or a certificate of deposit. If it is a check, the drawer must sign on the instrument if it's a draft or a check. And again, the location of the signature on the document is not important. It doesn't even have to be separate. If I write out a statement like, I, Griffin Pivotal, promise to pay Janelle $1,000, that's sufficient to act as a signature, even though it's not found in a separate signature block. So we need a signed writing, and the signed writing must contain this unconditional promise to pay. A negotiable instrument. The terms of the promise or order must be included in the writing on the face of the instrument. They must be specified and not implied. So a negotiable instrument must contain this express order or promise to pay. It cannot simply be an acknowledgement of a debt. It cannot simply indicate that I owe you a certain amount. So what we think of as a standard IOU is not a negotiable instrument. There must be additional languages along the line of to be paid on demand. An IOU is not a negotiable instrument. Now, the only exception to this rule is a certificate of deposit. A certificate of deposit does not require an express promise, because when the bank acknowledged deposit, the amount of the deposit, that was enough to indicate a promise to pay. When we talk an order to pay is associated with three-party instruments like a draft or a check, and in those cases, a command such as pay is mandatory. So thinking back to your checks, the reason why it always starts with those magic words, pay to the order of, is that in order to satisfy the law requiring negotiability, it must contain those words. If it does not contain the words pay to the order of, then the check may have less meaning than it would otherwise have. Now, we said it must be an unconditional promise to pay. So what is it that will make a promise or order conditional? Remember, a negotiable instrument's utility as a substitute for money or as a credit device would be dramatically reduced if it had conditional promises attached to it. And therefore, the transferability of the negotiable instrument would be greatly restricted. So to avoid such problems, the UCC provides that only instruments with unconditional promises or orders can be negotiable. Now, a promise or order is conditional and therefore not negotiable if it states, first of all, an express condition to payment, or states that the promise or order is subject or governed by another writing, or that the rights and obligations with respect to the promise or order are stated in another writing. The writing, the signed writing, must stand alone. We cannot refer to other documents within the context of the writing because that reduces the clarity and therefore seems to make the promise conditional. Similarly, we cannot make an express condition of payment. I promise to pay $1,000 provided that I am satisfied with the terms of this sale. That's an express condition of payment, and therefore that destroys negotiability. The promise or order has to meet the following conditions. Promise to pay or order to pay must be for a fixed amount of money, on demand or at an exact future time, to a specific person or to order or to the instrument's bearer. What do we mean by a fixed amount? A fixed amount. The term fixed amount means an amount that is ascertainable from the face of the instrument. We can figure it out from the face of the instrument. So it could be a note payable with 10% interest meets the requirement of a fixed amount because this amount can be determined at the time it's payable. So the fixed amount must contain an amount that's ascertainable from the face of the instrument. It doesn't have to be an exact figure, but it has to give us the meaning to calculate what that figure would be. And in fact, that amount can be with or without reference to some outside source of information. We could say plus interest at the rate, at the prime rate charged by the bank. That would be not found in the instrument itself, but again, could be easily ascertained. The amount has to be payable in money, and money means cash, it means coins. The amount must be payable in money. The UCC defines money as a medium of exchange authorized or adopted by a domestic or foreign government as a part of its currency. So rather than saying gold, I'll pay you $1,000 in gold, well, gold is not a medium of exchange adopted by the U.S. government, and therefore the note is not payable in money. Same thing would happen if the maker promised to pay $1,000 and 50 magnums of 1994 Chateau Lafite Rothschild wine, because again, the instrument is not payable entirely in money. The promise or order must contain a time for payment. A negotiable instrument must be payable on demand or at a definite time. And we need to have this available because it's essential to know when the maker, the drawer, or the acceptor is required to pay. Remember that an acceptor is a drawee who has accepted or agreed to pay an instrument when it's presented later for payment. It's also necessary to know when the obligations of secondary parties, such as endorsers, will arise. And of course, it's necessary to know when an instrument is due in order to calculate when the statute of limitations may apply. If the time is not found in the negotiable instrument, then it is presumed to be payable on demand when presented with to the maker of the note. A negotiable instrument can be payable at a definite time. An instrument is payable at a definite time if it states that it is payable on a specified date or within a definite period of time or on a date or a time readily ascertainable at the time the promise or order is made. Remember, instruments that are payable at a certain date and time rather than being payable on demand are often referred to as time instruments. The time instruments can have a non-fixed amount of time through what is called an acceleration clause. the acceleration clause would permit it's going to permit the payee or any other holder of a time instrument to demand payment of the entire amount or balance due. So this often occurs when such as a default in an installment payment is made. The acceleration clause will immediately make the entire amount of the note collectible. At the same time, instruments can contain an extension clause, meaning an extension clause is a clause in a time instrument that permits the date of maturity to be extended past the date found in the document. Now, to keep the instrument negotiable, the interval of the extension must be specified if the right to extend is given to the maker or drawer of the instrument. So we can extend time for payment of a document without destroying negotiability. Finally, the promise or order to pay must be made to a specific person or to the instrument's bearer, because one of the functions of a negotiable instrument is to serve as a substitute for money. Freedom of transfer is essential, and the instrument must indicate on its face that it is created to be transferred. And how do we do this? By writing the phrase "to the order of" or some other similar words near the payee's name. So to assure a proper transfer, the instrument must be payable to order or to the bearer at the time it is issued. So a negotiable instrument can be an order instrument or it can be a bearer instrument. An order instrument is an instrument that's payable to the order of any identified person or to an identified person or order. An identified person is the person to whom the instrument is initially payable as determined by the intent of the maker. Now, the identified person, however, can then transfer the instrument to whomever he or she wishes. Thus, the maker is agreeing to pay either the person specified on the instrument or whomever that person might designate. So in this way, the instrument retains its transferability. Now, a bearer instrument is a negotiable instrument payable to bearer or to cash rather than to an identifiable payee. So a bearer instrument is an instrument that doesn't designate a specific payee, but instead the term bearer refers to a person who is going to be in possession of an instrument. This means that the maker or the drawer of the instrument agrees to pay anyone who presents the instrument for payment. An instrument payable to any of the following is a bearer instrument. For instance, payable to the order of bearer, payable to Jane Smith or bearer, payable to bearer, payable to cash, pay cash. Sometimes you can cash a check by writing pay to the order of cash. That's a bearer instrument, pay to the order of cash. So in any of these situations, the document, the instrument becomes a bearer instrument. So those are all the requirements of negotiability, and there's a lot of rules there. You're just going to need to go back and review all of those rules. But there are some factors that may sound like they affect negotiability, that you might think affect negotiability, but don't. For instance, an instrument can be undated. We've talked about all the requirements for a negotiable instrument, and oftentimes there's a place for a date on a draft or on a promissory note. But unless the date of the instrument is necessary to determine a definite time for payment, the fact that an instrument is undated does not affect its negotiability. So, and if a check is not dated, Under the UCC, its date is the date of its issue, meaning the date on which the drawer first delivered the check to another person in order to give that person rights on that check. An instrument can be post-dated. We can fill in a date after the time of issuance. Once again, unless that date is necessary to determine the amount of payment, it can be post-dated as well. Alterations do not necessarily affect negotiability. If we write through or strike through something, written or typewritten alterations do not necessarily affect negotiability. Words and numbers can be different. You know, again, when writing a check, you have to write the numbers as well as the words. And even if they don't match, that doesn't mean the check is not negotiable. Instead, we look at the rules that say that words trump figures unless the words are ambiguous in and of themselves. The negotiable instrument doesn't need an interest rate. Even if it says payable, pay $1,000 plus interest, that interest rate is what we call the judgment rate of interest, which is a rate of interest that's fixed by a state statute. And we substitute that judgment rate of interest for the interest that is missing from the note. So on your test, look for some factors that certainly indicate that it would be non-negotiable, but in fact, they do not destroy negotiability. So in conclusion, what do we learn today? A negotiable instrument has to be assigned writing. It must contain an unconditional promise to pay. It must meet certain conditions. And then there are factors that sound like they affect negotiability, but in fact do not. Thanks for listening.